I'm Daryl McCarthy, and I serve as director of the European Academic Network. And several years ago, I really felt a calling to evangelize on university campuses. Actually, in 1974 was when I received that call. And in those days, when I thought of evangelizing on university campuses, and I thought of apologetics, I thought of providing evidence that demands a verdict, which was very powerful in those days, making rational arguments for Christianity. But over the years, since I've been lecturing at universities around different countries, I found that there are other approaches which sometimes are even less threatening, which can make a case for the truth of Christianity. So we want to talk today about the amazing power of history to make a difference today. Basically, how do we use apologetics? How do we make a case for apologetics through history? Now, this is an amazing avenue that I think we're really overlooking here. And I'm glad my brother Anthony from Minsk is here, because he has been doing this himself in Minsk, Belarus. And in a few minutes, you'll hear from my colleagues Jaroslaw Lukasik from the East European Leadership Forum in Kiev, who led the Reformation 500 project, and from my long-term colleague, Dr. Chuck White, who's a professional historian. So neither Jaroslaw or I are professional historians, so he'll weigh in on, here's what the real experts say about apologetics and history as well. But let's just first of all look at why we should study history. Now, history can provide a cultural impact by showing what God has done in the past. In our pluralistic world, where evangelical faith is ridiculed and sidelined and considered to be meaningless, unimportant, and insignificant, we can show how Christianity has made a difference in history. And this shows the transformative impact that Christ has made on believers, and through evangelism and changing nations, lifting economies, and bringing massive cultural change. Secondly, when we study history, it helps us to understand our spiritual genealogy. Now, in one line of my biological family, I am a fifth-generation Christian. And so I can look back 5 generations and see what God has done in my family. But studying a larger history of the church, it reminds us that generations before us have been faithful to God in carrying the faith to us and passing the baton of faith to us. And it helps us to understand our place now in 2019 in the larger panorama of the history of God's people, especially the church over the last 2019 years. It helps us to realize, there is a cloud of many witnesses that are a part of our spiritual heritage. And also it shows us that the history of the church has been made up of real people. When we read about what God has done in the past, we realize that Christianity doesn't spread automatically. It's spread through the obedience of one Christian after another Christian. And it's transmitted by people with real problems, real weaknesses, real strengths, simply sharing their faith on a particular day, and that has passed the faith along. Os Guinness shares this amazing story of how a farmer in Scotland many years ago, heard a servant girl singing across the field. And that song eventually led to the Guinness family coming to faith in Christ. And now Oz is, after, 7 generations, still serving God. Spiritual growth. It helps us to realize the depth of devotion, the dedication, the sacrifice that those who have gone before us have exhibited. When we heard in the Bible study with Ramez that first morning about the Egyptian believers who were beheaded, these are simple workers. They were not pastors, they were not theologians, they were not scholars, but they're simple adherents to the faith. You know their story will still be being told if Jesus tarries 200 years from now. because they made history through the tenacity of their faith. So we can honor the great women and men of faith who have lived before us. We can learn lessons from them by studying history. So I hope by the end of our minutes together, you will say, I want to go back home and learn more about the history of what God's people have done. But it also reminds us that the church is fragile and the church is strong. We see that the church, my wife often says, one of the biggest proofs that the church is from God is it still exists with all its brokenness and fallibility and dysfunctionality, and yet it's still here. So we realize it's fragile, but it's strong in spite of being so human and so flawed and so broken. Somehow it survives. And then it provides a context for world events. So when we look at places that are having Christian-Muslim conflict, which takes in a big part of the world today, we can look back in history and see how those problems have been handled before. I gave a workshop a couple of days ago on classic books, and one of the books I recommended shows the history of the Eastern Church, how Christianity spread with the Nestorians from Jerusalem right on across to China in the 7th century, and how they dealt with the Muslim conflict for hundreds of years. And I believe God wants us to study history. It's a very clear command. In fact, we're adjoined to say, great are the works of the Lord. They are pondered by all who delight in them. Why does God constantly say, remember, I brought you out of Egypt? Because it gives us a sense of thankfulness, remembering what God has done. So studying the history of God's people can bring a sense of thankfulness. So remember all the times that God had His people repeat historical events. So the Passover, it happened once, and then they're to remember it every year in a very systematic way. That's studying history. Remember the many times they celebrated the miracle of the deliverance from Egypt. The manna, keep it for generations to come so they can see the bread I gave you. That's studying church history. The stones from Jordan, stack them up as a memorial for remembering what God has done. Terry and I are reading through Joshua right now. They made a memorial to show what God had done in that day. That's studying it. Every time we celebrate communion, we're celebrating what God has done in the past. Now, I want to share with you some reasons why history serves as a good bridge to unbelievers and to believers as well. When I lecture at universities, one of the easiest ways to present Christianity is by presenting historical events. Now, why is that so easy? And why is it received so well? I remember one time we were in China, where Terry had lived for many years before we were married, and we stayed in Beijing, and every day I would fly out to a different city, and I gave lessons on the history of the Irish monks and how they had gone across Europe teaching and evangelizing. Now, every lecture, there was a communist minder right there in the lecture hall, but for a week I gave lectures at major universities in China on Christianity. And to tell the story of the Irish monks, you have to tell the gospel, because that's what they were spreading across Europe. And it was kosher. It was okay. Why? Well, because it's history. So here's some reasons why it's good, and I hope I can motivate you to think about using history as an apologetics tool. Number one, history's factual. It's there. It's not subjective. You're not trying to convince somebody about a doctrinal point. People can study history, and though it can be distorted, to be sure, we're seeing that especially these days, and it can be rewritten. But underlying all the accounts, there are facts that happened. Secondly, history can be less threatening. You're just telling what happened. It's no big thing to you if I give you an account from history. It's less threatening. I'm just saying you can draw your own conclusions. And number three, it's interesting. People love a good story. They get drawn into the story. And history is, of course, a story. So all we're doing is telling a story of something that really happened to make the case for faith. So we want to share with you some ways we have used history as a bridge. So several years ago, 1988, I helped start a little ministry to send Christian professors to teach in universities outside of the U.S. and UK. And in 1993, I made my first attempt to use history as a bridge. So I gave a series of lectures at Peking University, which is their premier university, on the role of Christianity in the development of early Western higher education. Now, China is a communist country, and they have to mind the protocols of Marxism, Maoism. So how could I get away telling about the Christian origin? Because it was telling about history. It was okay. It was non-threatening. One of my favorite stories to tell is, of course, about the Irish. With a name like McCarthy, naturally I'm going to be interested in all things Irish. Terry and I lived in Lithuania for 5 years. Now, St. Patrick's Day has become a big holiday in many countries around the world. Now, the tragedy is, usually it's just simply an excuse to drink more alcohol than normal. And so every year in Lithuania, I would do a public lecture at our university, where Terry was a professor, on St. Patrick and the Irish, the teacher who created a nation and saved civilization, a model for educators with historic impact. Or why St. Patrick's Day became a global holiday. Lessons for educators from Patrick and the Irish monks who saved civilization. Now, the reason that's a great story is because Patrick was converted by the gospel. As a slave, the Holy Spirit came to him in dreams. He saw the good news, and he repented of his sins. He responded, and he became a follower of Jesus. And later, when he fled his captivity, you know the story, came back to England, then God called him to go to the very place of his slavery. And so Lithuanian students would say, now when Patrick started preaching, you said tens of thousands of people responded to his preaching and teaching. Why did they do this? Aha, thank you for asking. Well, I would say, can you imagine that you had never heard that Jesus had died so your sins could be forgiven? That because Jesus died on the cross, you didn't have to be a better person. You didn't have to work or pay money or try really hard to find forgiveness for all the bad things you've done. Jesus paid the price. If you had never heard that, don't you think you would respond to a message like this? Now, of course, sadly, in Lithuania, 78% Catholic, another 22% or so Russian Orthodox. I never met a Catholic in Lithuania that had ever heard the gospel through the Catholic Church. I never met an Orthodox that had heard the gospel through the Orthodox Church. I'm not saying there are no born-again Catholics or Orthodox. It's just they're not spreading the gospel. And so that was my opportunity in this official university lecture to present the gospel. Threatening? No, I'm just telling history. Just telling a story. That's safe enough, isn't it? Well, now recently we had one of the best opportunities ever, and this opportunity will continue because we have 5 years now that we're celebrating the Reformation. 1517, posting the theses on the door, Martin Luther. So, I've been lecturing at universities on Here I Stand, how the Protestant Reformation changed our world. This is a powerful opportunity, and Jaroslaw will tell us in a few minutes how it's transformed the church in Ukraine and indeed in Belarus. It's a bridge for believers. So telling about great Christians of the past. How did C.S. Lewis walk with God? This is a bridge for believers to say, hey, we can learn from famous Christians. In my case, since I lead the academic network, I'm working with professors across Europe. How can I help them understand that being a follower of Jesus means you're on a mission? Lewis called himself a hot gospeler. The reason he never got the promotion he deserved at Oxford was because he was so busy telling other people about Jesus. He really offended a lot of people. But it was a price he was willing to pay. Well, in our Safe Zone Academy today, Christian academics need to understand there's a price to be paid. I may have to stick my neck out occasionally to make Christ known. So telling the story of what Lewis did. And of course, some of you may have gone through what's called the Perspectives course. And this is a large part of this Perspectives course to give people a view of global missions. It includes, in large part, the expansion of the world Christian movement, how Jesus' kingdom spreads around the world. And when we see what God has been doing for 2,000 years, then we can understand, wait a minute, it's not going to happen naturally without us being engaged today. We must do something as well. And I've done the lectures on the expansion of Islam as well and how it changed our world. Chuck, why don't you comment as a professional historian, because I know your heart is evangelism and as well as apologetics. So let's give us your take.
I'd just like to underline what Daryl said about how history, Lewis talked about how fiction gets past watchful dragons. And I think history does the same thing, because people have their guard up against, if you say, I'm going to tell you the gospel. But if you say, I'm going to tell you a story, a true story, oftentimes they will listen to that. And for instance, I've recently been to the Ukraine and have talked mainly about history. One of the talks I gave is called Immaterial Roots of Material Prosperity. How did the world, if you look at the economic history of the world for about the last 30,000 years, up until the middle of the 18th century, it was just survival. And then at the beginning of the 18th century, something happened. And of course, it's the Industrial Revolution. But then you can talk about what are the immaterial roots? What are the things that people have to believe to have prosperity happen? And there's a fellow named Jay Richards who has a video called 10 Tough Steps to Eliminating Poverty, World Poverty in 10 Tough Steps. And my talk is based on that. And the steps aren't exactly the same, but they're similar. And to point out that the roots to get to prosperity are all biblical. And so I gave the talk, and then I said, now as a Christian, I realized I can know where those steps came from. And so then I could open the door to people being more open to Christianity. Also, my specialty as an undergraduate was the history and literature of England. And so I learned about the Wesleyan revival and the Halavey thesis and how the Wesleyan revival prevented a bloody French Revolution. And so you talk about that and the difference that made. Or Niall Ferguson wrote a book called Empire, in which he explains how that the evangelicals, in the 19th century, going into the British colonial service, made the British colonies the most prosperous of all the different colonies in the world, and set them up for the kind of development that they have experienced now in the 20th century, and created the best situation in the developing world. Or I was reading a book, or actually I was listening to a book about the British Navy, and it turns out that the British Navy in the 16th and 17th century were basically pirates and slave traders. And they were an immense force for evil in the world. But then by the 19th century, they had become a force. They got rid of pirates, they stopped slavery, and they began the process of globalization, which has led to the spread of prosperity around the world. And the British Navy, for instance, would publish maps and charts for people to use so that trade could happen better. And it was largely because evangelicals went into the British Navy. And I was talking to a guy about this, and he said, do you, and I was telling him some of these things, and he says, do you know I'm a naval historian? And I said, no. And he said, well, you don't know half the story. He says, it's true about what happened with the effect of the British Navy. He says, but do you know what happened with the sailors themselves? And I said, no. He said, well, in the 16th and 17th century, the sailors were they were impressed. They were just forced to be in the Navy. They were controlled by being beaten and by being given rum so that they were controllable. But he said when enough evangelicals went into the Admiralty, it changed the way the British sailors were treated. They stopped impression, they stopped the rum, and they stopped beating them, and they started treating them decently. And so, I didn't even know that part of the story. Well, I could go on, but there are so many different stories where the gospel has made the difference. One last thing. My grandson and I had been playing a game called Bismarck, which is where the British go out and try to sink the Bismarck, and the Bismarck, the German side, tries to avoid that. And then we watched a video about it, and in the video they showed a reunion from some of the sailors that were on the Bismarck and some of the sailors that were on the Prince of Wales and other ships that were trying to sink the Bismarck and eventually did sink it. And they have a reunion now every year in Britain. And I said to my grandson, I said, oh, isn't that amazing? Here are guys who were trying to kill each other, but because they come from nations that are at least nominally Christian, instead of, now it's 50 years later, instead of their grandchildren trying to kill each other, these guys are meeting and fellowshipping and telling stories and being friends with each other. And I said, that's brand new in the history of the world, because conflicts used to have generation after generations of revenge. But because of Christianity, that doesn't happen. And so, all history is God's story. And so even the good things and the bad things, you can see what the story is and help tell God's part of the story. So those are some of the ways that history, I think, can help us do that pre-evangelism.
So Jaroslaw is the director of the East European Leadership Forum, which does for the Russian, Belarusian, Ukrainian-speaking world what you are experiencing this week here at ELF. So in each November in Kiev, there will be 300 to 600 Christian leaders come together in a format almost identical to this, but it's all in Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian. And Jaroslaw is Polish, was converted, went as a missionary to Belarus, and then was deported because of his work among intellectuals, and now is in exile in Kiev, Ukraine, and is carrying on a great work there. And Anthony, your colleague here in this network, is very much involved, of course, in the leadership of the East European Leadership Forum. But when the Reformation came, Jaroslaw had this vision for what could be done with this celebration of 500 years to make a case for the gospel in a very divided nation such as Ukraine, where the denominations hated each other, the Christians weren't even getting along, and then how could we reach the lost? So Jaroslaw, tell us the story of how all this came about and what the difference it made. And I think you're having some things passed out as well.
Yeah, hello. I'm sorry for my English, it's not very well. So I try to explain with my broken English. Tell about something about 500 years of Reformation in Ukraine. But in the beginning, I want to say that the idea of making anniversary of Reformation is given by Anthony. He's a pastor from Belarus in Minsk. I remember during night prayer, he said, "Oh, I have idea." In April 2002, let's do 450 years of Reformation in Belarus, such program. So in 2003, we initiated such program for Belarusian churches, and it was very many projects that united Belarusian denominations during all the year. Belarusian intelligence joined us, and it was quite good impact in this total, we can say, authoritarian state. It's not easy to preach the gospel. It's not freedom there. So in 2007 I was deported from Belarus. So with my family, we moved to Ukraine, to Kiev, with the same messages. So I'm very focused on spreading Christian values to the culture, to the national cultures, especially such cultures like Belarusian or Ukrainian, where there is not shaped yet. History is very good tool for shaping, we can say, young culture. Yeah. So in 2016, it was an initiative of among Ukrainian denominations and some Ukrainian politicians, evangelical, to do the same similar program that we did in Belarus. So in 2016, it was a joined. It was created a steering committee, and in this anniversary, really took part almost 30 different Protestant denominations of Ukraine. So, and also we received, because of lobby of our Baptist deputies, receive a decree of president about anniversary Reformation. So every officer in Ukraine received paper about anniversary Reformation. So you need to do something about this. So it was really large project. I never imagined that it could have such many events. So you have in these papers, you have 5 goals of the year of Reformation. I have not time to read it, so I invite you to study this. And also 22, 23 different projects that was done. Yeah, so it was, for example, hundreds of motivational conferences about Reformation. Daryl McCarthy also shared at such conferences. Hundreds of conferences around table for secular audience. It was prayer breakfasts, publishing documental movies about Reformation, good quality movies. One of them was showed by national TV. It was big boards, media projects, 10 millions of brochures about Reformation. We had, for example, such a journal about the movement that changed the world. It's about Reformation. It was printed 109,000 copies. Other, like, for example, this is an interesting catalog of ideas. Before starting Year of Reformation. So what churches can do for, it was 11,000 copies of such. So it was, I can say that really this year changed the church. So after, and also here you have 10 fruits of Year of Reformation. So what are fruits of after 2017? Yeah, you can study. The church, first time, Ukrainian Evangelical Church, united church, very united during this first time that church is really united for doing something systematical way, not at once, but systematical way during many months. And church, first time in the history in Ukraine, went out from the prayer from the buildings and went to public square in systematic and massive way, and it continued until today. So today is also so after Year of Reformation, after this anniversary, it was created a Reformation movement, and that use all this structure. By the way, in every city, many towns, even villages, it was created steering committees from different representative of different denominations, 10 different networks. By the way, almost the same network that we have at Eastern European Leadership Forum. networks that worked during a long time for accomplish this. So now there is a Reformation movement, and especially Reformation movement is focused on after 2017 on defending on family values. So there is family forums. For example, in March we had a family forum, national family forum for a couple thousands of representatives and President of Ukraine, Prime Minister, many ministers, members of the government. They took part in this family forum, and also in various cities it's continued to be. For example, last Wednesday I also had gave a lecture in one of such family forums near Kiev, in the city near Kiev.
How did it change the view of evangelicals in the intelligentsia and the elite in Ukraine?
Yeah. So it was, by the way, one of our goals written in spring 2016 was to raise or to change the image of the church, because the evangelical church in Ukraine, Belarus, Russia has image of the sect. This is American sect. So our goal in our messages were that we need to change it. We need to show, sorry, Protestants are more progressive in positive sense. The church, it's the civilization, the Western civilization is created by Reformation. The Reformation is very foundation of Western civilization. And we, gave arguments, historical arguments, in books, in brochures, in journals. Yeah, so I can absolutely say that now, especially for intelligentsia, it's new view of evangelical church now. By the way, one of fruits of this year of Reformation was that in Ukraine, it is lobbied by Protestants that we have 25 December is a national, is a state holiday, because before it was only Orthodox. It was 7th January, and now is also 25 of December.
It's a massive movement. They had a Reformation celebration in Kiev, in Maidan Square, where the revolution took place in 2014. How many people were there, probably?
Oh, it's difficult to say, but it's something between 150,000 people until 200,000 people gathered together. So there is video in YouTube. So it was after Maidan. It was absolutely fierce. Such gatherings, so many people gathered together, and it was focused on. It was devoted to 500 years of Reformation, and by the way, one of these goals, the fourth one, is provide the guidance for reforms in public life. So it's very providential that now Ukraine, after Maidan and after war with Russia, is turned to the West. First time in history, is turned to the West and is looking for such phenomena that has Western society, such phenomena like right of man, like dignity of human dignity, like prosperity, economic prosperity, supreme of law, democracy, other things. Yeah. So we show that Reformation, the Bible, like foundation of the society, is a source of such phenomena. So it was very good received by elites.